A portion of this video was sponsored by Domino's.
Yeah, Jay and I have an idea that we think is pretty awesome for what would happen.
We recently talked to the director of Portal 2, Josh Weier, and Erik Wolpaw, who wrote Portal 1 and 2 and tons more Valve games. Our last Portal video was on Portal 2's cut content, but in our interviews, these two brought up tons of interesting stuff. So many stories about the making of Portal games were dropped on us, and we knew we had to make 2 videos. So today we'll be talking about behind-the-scenes stories for the Portal series, including Portal 3. More on that later. Talking to Erik, it became clear why he's a comedy writer. He told us a story from when the devs were wrapping up development on Portal 2, and he and level designer David Sawyer butted heads. Towards the end of the game, there's a conveyor belt leading into an industrial masher, essentially a death trap. Erik and his writing partner Jay Pinkerton had a Wheatley bit planned for this part, and finalized it about 48 hours before the lines were due to be recorded in Steve Merchant's final session. At the last minute, they ran it by the guy who was in charge of this area, level designer David Sawyer. But we'll let Erik tell the rest of the story because the frustration in his voice makes it twice as funny.
Jay and I record some quick temp dialogue, put it in there. Level designer, guy I love, no longer works at Valve, Dave Sawyer, but tempers are running short at the end of this project, and it's, you know, a day now before we are going to be in the studio, and I'm back at home. It's the evening, and Jay calls me up, and he's like, Sawyer says it's not a death trap, and I'm like, it's a death trap. Thing mashes you. I mean, I'm losing my mind. Like, it is a death trap. It is a death trap. And we're, you know, bitching. I'm like, but we also know we're gonna have to change this thing. We're gonna have to rewrite this thing because we're gonna, you know, even though it's very, to this day, I would get Dave on the phone and be like, it's a death trap. But at some point, I'm ranting and raving, and I'm like, well, if it's not a death trap, it's at least a death option. And then at some point, and then we're just like, oh shit, that's better than what we had. And so you probably don't remember, but he, instead of a death trap, he gives a whole speech about it being a death option.
So in the final game, Wheatley says it's a death option, and pitches it to players as an easy way to end things. Erik believes that Sawyer's reasoning for it not being a death trap was because it could be avoided. But to this day, Erik is adamant that it's a death trap. We told Erik we'd ask you guys if you think it's a death trap or not.
It's a death trap. All right. If they say it's not a death trap, they're wrong.
So let us know in the comments. Is it a death trap or not? Our interview with Erik happened after we spoke to Portal 2 director Josh Weier, so we quizzed Erik on some of what we learned from Josh. There's tons of Portal 2 areas that didn't end up in the final game, like this mysterious diorama exhibit that looks like it might have explained some of the game's lore. We got the scoop on it from both Josh and Erik. But before we get to that, a word from this episode's sponsor. This portion of this video is sponsored by Domino's. It's just our opinion, but pizza is probably the best meal for a night of gaming. And with Domino's, you can get great pizza delivered to your door quickly and easily, just like we did. We fueled a gaming session of our own with Domino's Ultimate Pepperoni Pizza and a side of Parmesan bread twists. We even tried Domino's Honolulu Hawaiian Pizza, because it's okay to get a bit weird with pizza toppings. Give them a try yourself. And whatever you don't eat while gaming, you can just reheat the next day and it's basically as good as new. Now that's value for money. But the value goes even further for you guys, because Domino's is giving us a coupon code just for our subscribers that you can use until December 15th, 2022. All you need to do is head to Domino's.com and use our promo code by clicking on the link in the description box to get 20% off your entire online order at menu price until December 15th. So hurry, because this deal won't last long. Thanks again to Domino's for sponsoring that part of our video. And now, back to the trivia. So yeah, Josh Weier and Erik Wolpaw gave us the scoop. Josh told us that this segment of the game was going to play out like a ride at a theme park, and specifically compared it to Disneyland's It's a Small World ride. There'd be a whole song and dance number about the history of Aperture science while the player went through this ride, with its purpose being to inform Aperture's visitors and bring them up to speed. The idea was abandoned when the Portal 2 team realized that exploring the lore bit by bit across the game could lead to better storytelling, rather than blowing it all on one gag. Josh also told us that the history on display would have been told through the lens of Aperture, so everything mentioned would have been heavily skewed to make them look better, and have all their horrendous actions seem a little more palatable. Erik went into even more detail, and revealed that this segment was actually from a very early build of Portal 2, when the game still used the elusive f-stop mechanic. Erik told us, "The diorama thing was part of the f-stop version of Portal 2, which had a slightly different plot. I think it had to do with robots taking over the Aperture facility. And it had actually been mocked up. I mean, real rough, but I know we had art assets for it. These art assets were only roughly drawn out, but the final game would have apparently used a sketchy art style for the set pieces along the ride." Erik continued, telling us that the whole section would have had a narrator talking the player through the ride, and it would have been similar to a part in BioShock Infinite. The part of BioShock Infinite Erik's referring to is the Hall of Heroes, a museum that tells the historical events of the game's setting, Columbia. The Hall of Heroes is very similar to how Josh and Erik described the Portal 2 diorama, with each exhibit coming across as propaganda. In our last video on Portal 2, Josh told us about an unused scene where the player would come across Cave Johnson after his consciousness had been put into a computer which was inside of a cube. The player would then need to pull the plug on Johnson and use the cube to complete a puzzle and climb over a lip. We asked Erik if he remembered any more details about it, and he told us that Cave Johnson being put into a computer was not only written and implemented when Portal 2 was still using the f-stop mechanic, but it was actually a huge plot point of the original version of the game. Erik added, "So that went away and we kind of got rid of that whole thing. Actually, some of that dialogue we wrote for the original version showed up in Portal 2 Perpetual Testing Initiative, which was sort of a map maker, and there's actually some funny stuff in there. The plot has all these alternate universe Cave Johnsons, and one of them is a cave that gets put into a computer, and some of those lines are straight from the very original version of that idea." When we spoke to Josh Weier, he couldn't really remember why this scene was scrapped, but Erik did. One of the biggest reasons was simply because it was hard to get the physics on the cord to Cave Johnson's computer to function properly. And while we were talking to Erik about things Josh had said, we brought up Garfield. Long story short, early in development for Portal 2's co-op, Erik and the other writers toyed with the idea of having players collect human artifacts, and one of these artifacts was a Garfield comic strip parody called Dorfeld. When we spoke to Josh, he was adamant that the gag stemmed from the writers' collective hate of Garfield, and that they'd always dunk on it any way they could. We brought this up to Erik, and his response was kinda surprising.
Really? No, I got nothing against Garfield. No, we were just thinking, what's a generic comic? And Garfield was the first one that came to our mind, just because it's also one that everybody kind of knows.
There seems to have been some misunderstanding about how much the writers hate Garfield. Or maybe it was one of the Portal 2's other writers, Jay Pinkerton or Chet Falasek, who really has it in for Garfield. Either way, we thought this was pretty funny. Some of the more interesting behind-the-scenes stories are ones that you couldn't guess on your own from playing the game, but make total sense once you've heard them. While making Portal 2, the devs had a problem. The original Portal did a great job at teaching players how portals worked, and all the test chambers honed their thinking for solving portal puzzles. The devs needed to teach new Portal 2 players the same set of skills, and this brought up an issue. How could they teach new players but also make sure that folks who played the original Portal didn't feel like they were rehashing the same game? The answer, surprisingly, came from Super Metroid. Josh Weier is a huge fan of Super Metroid, and one part of the game that sat with him was the game's opening where Samus goes through the Ceres space colony as it's all clean and empty, then has to run through it again in reverse while everything's falling apart. This made them think about reusing the same test chambers from Portal 1 for the opening of Portal 2 to train players, but having them all be derelict. This means they're not simply a training tool for new players, they also clue old players into the overall state of Aperture and add to the story. Josh told us about this in our call, but credit where credit's due. Josh originally talked about this on the Kiwi Talks podcast, and that's the whole reason we wanted to bring it up to him in the first place. Portal 2's development had other inspirations, like the speedrunning community. We asked Josh what was the biggest cut feature from Portal 2, and he said it was probably bullet time. This was a mechanic where players could hit a button and slow things down, making it easier for the average player to pull off complex maneuvers that usually only highly skilled players could perform. It'd also make the game more accessible in general. Josh elaborated, "If you look at Portal, there's the first time where you have to put a portal down, walk through, and reset the portal so you go farther, and there was a massive drop-off in people finishing the game because they couldn't pull it off. And we looked at Portal and said, look, we've got all these people who wouldn't typically come to a first-person shooter type game, why would we leave them on the roadside? So bullet time basically let them hit a button and do the cool ninja thing." Josh went on to say that although it was cool and opened up new possibilities, the devs thought it felt a bit gimmicky and didn't fit the game's design. They wanted to embrace the simplicity of the original Portal, where all the player does is place portals and everything else in the game fits around it. The nice thing about Portal is you really just had the portal gun, and all the mechanics flow from that. This one didn't, and it required an extra button, and kinda had this different thread, so we felt that although it was neat, it didn't really fit. Josh also told us that although development didn't reach the point where an in-universe explanation for bullet time had been implemented, he believes that it was going to be introduced as a new function of the portal gun. But even after they embraced this minimalist design philosophy, some new ideas got left behind. The biggest new addition to Portal 2 was the gels, but two of them didn't make it: Reflection Gel and Adhesion Gel. We asked Josh about the cut gels, and he remembered Adhesion Gel as the one they worked on the most before cutting it. Any surface that you painted, you could just walk on as if that were down effectively, or as if you had sticky feet on the gel. It was neat, you could do cool things, but it made people sick so incredibly quickly. We didn't see a way to ship it because even the hardened veterans would rotate up onto a wall and that was the end of them. They just go, "I gotta lay down," and it would take out people for days. And at the point it was coming into the project, we were like, we got plenty of stuff already. The team were already hitting a certain level of complexity by asking players to think with portals in mind, and bending the player's perspective was adding another layer of complexity. In the end, Adhesion Gel was causing more harm than good. And like Josh said, they had enough other stuff to work with anyways. Josh left Valve a while back and went his own way, but Erik is currently still working for them. So we asked him some questions about Valve and his future plans. Since there's been a few Portal spin-off games since the release of Portal 2, we asked him how he felt about those, and if he felt protective about other studios licensing an IP he worked hard to establish. He told us the only reason he'd feel protective is if doing more spin-offs made it less likely he'd be able to make a Portal 3. Otherwise, he's all for them. Over the years, it's become a bit of a meme that Valve can't make games with a 3 in the title. There's some truth to it. Valve made lots of sequels that haven't yet had sequels themselves. So we brought it up to Erik and asked if he thought it was a coincidence, or maybe there was a part of the company culture preventing trilogies from being made. Erik told us, "I don't know, it's almost like the numbering system works against us because we made Half-Life 2, then sorta made a 3, but it was an episode, so maybe that was just the luck of the draw." I don't think so. I think Valve staff just keep getting sucked into other stuff. Someday, hopefully, there will be a 3 of something. Erik said a lack of trilogies definitely isn't deliberate, but he does have a theory as to why, sort of. After a developer finishes their first game in a new IP, they look back and see errors in what they made. They get new ideas for gameplay and think of ways to make existing parts of the game better. Then, they're driven to make a sequel because they want to fix all these lingering issues, and when they eventually fix all those issues for the sequel, they're left mostly satisfied. So when the opportunity arises to make a third game, developers aren't as driven to make it because they've already fulfilled their biggest wants for a sequel. Essentially, they're less driven and less interested in doing a third title because there's no regrets left to rectify. And that might be true for most developers, but it doesn't seem to be the case for Erik. Josh Weier told us that Erik is still pretty enthusiastic about Portal. So we asked Erik if he wants to make a Portal 3 and if he had any ideas for it.
Yeah, Jay and I have an idea that we think is pretty awesome for what would happen, generally speaking. I mean, we don't have a script or any details worked out, but we have sort of a starting point that we like a ton. It's good that we have this idea, but there's a lot left to do. I mean, somebody's got to think up some new Portal puzzles and, but we do have an actual idea, yes.
Well, damn. It seems like Jay and Erik might have enough of an idea to get the ball rolling on a Portal 3. We asked if they'd pushed for another Portal to happen at Valve, or if they'd at least brought it up around the office. Apparently they have brought it up at work, and they've gotten a positive response about their idea. But it seems like they're gonna need a few more people on board. But again, us having that idea versus actually committing to making a game is a way different thing. It's not unknown, but there's no formal pitch process at Valve either, so it's always kind of a, grassroots campaign, I guess. After hearing this, we asked what it would actually take to get Portal 3 into development. Erik believes work would have to start during a period where people weren't otherwise engaged, because it'd be irresponsible to tempt people to leave a project they're already knee-deep in production on. It's a bit of office politics, but it'd be bad form to poach people away from other teams during the less interesting parts of a game's development where people just need to hunker down and get stuff done. Based on what Erik told us, it doesn't seem to be a lack of ideas or enthusiasm that's stopping a Portal 3 from being made, but timing. All we can do is hope that the timing is right sometime soon, and let the folks at Valve know that we really do want to see Portal 3 get made. Did you also know that Portal 2 originally had a collection of death endings that could be set off at various parts of the game that'd trigger the credits and be accompanied by a dedicated song? For more Portal 2 cut content, click or tap the video on screen. Special thanks to Erik Wolpaw and Josh Weier for taking the time to talk to us, and thank you for watching. See you next time.